but whether you believe it or not, you're intimidating to the administrators because you're voting on their tenure and their contracts and so forth. You need to be a lot better about following your own board policy regarding chain of command, which happens to work both ways. You want information coming up to you through the chain of command. I want information going back down to building level and district staff members through the chain of command. If you have a concern about what's going on in the parking situation at Berkeley School, I want to know about it. And then I'll go and I'll bring you outside with me. Not to say that I'm holding their hands, but I've really been trying to educate them about the fact that whether they believe it or not, they have this cloak of authority, which is quite off-putting.
Right, absolutely.
I've done the same thing. I mean, we have a very, very small districts where people are always there and talking to someone, but board members know not to talk to the building principal about a situation without letting me know first.
Right, and then the other thing that I always ask that all the administrators do, it's harder with teachers because they don't report directly to you, but with administrators, I ask that they let me know right away if a board member has asked them questions or has a specific issue, or God forbid said something horrible about what was going on in the building, or for any reason. And I think that's important because the administrators need to let us know, because the last thing we want is to be blindsided at a board meeting. And especially here in a district where some of the administrators have been there a very long time, they've had the board members' children, they have personal relationships, it can be very difficult for a school level leader to know, well, what should I say and what shouldn't I say? And in some of the districts, superintendents change every few years, but the administrators have been there for a very long time. And I was in a district where a principal went to a board member saying how they didn't like the superintendent, and this is why. And that got back to the superintendent. The superintendent was new, and the superintendent had the full support of the board because the board likes to feel, at least the board who hires you likes to feel like you're doing a good job. And this principal, colleague of mine, was made absolutely miserable for 3 years. Now that's as long as the superintendent lasted, was 3 years, because a lot of her points actually were pretty bad. But to bring it up to a board member, especially one who had just hired the person, and it was a huge mistake. I will never forget, because we were at an administrative council meeting and the new superintendent, I'm not a screamer, but I think some people are, and was just pounding up, screaming at his administrative staff. And we're all looking around like, who did it? Who made that stupid mistake? So that's just something. I always ask that the administrator talk to me, say, call me, email me, say, Joe Smith stopped by. He asked questions about the art program, the parking situation, and I don't know how many tardies are going on in the school. He asked me these 3 questions. This is what I told him. Enough.
And frankly, for me, that is the whole problem with board membership, because they have no business doing that.
Exactly.
And that's just one example of all the ways that they do things that they're not supposed to be doing, and it causes trouble. And educating them and getting board members to follow the rules is the hard part.
Exactly. And no matter how many times school boards tells them, I don't know, I know Jill's on a Board of Ed, but if you've ever been to those Board of Ed trainings where they say, you don't run the district, you make sure the district is run well. For every time I've heard that, I've heard a board member say, but how do I know if the district's being run well if I don't know what's happening in the schools? So they flip it back. I think Jill would have heard that. But they flip it back and they make it sound like, but it's their responsibility. Like they feel, some, not all, but some feel this overwhelming desire. Well, how can I possibly make good decisions if I don't know everything that's going on? And that does come down to trust too. I mean, think about it. Do they, Jeff, do they trust you to tell them what's going on in the school, or do they have to find it out themselves?
It's all about trust.
Well, and that's where the communication vehicles become so important. Some of you have sat in seminars that I talk about every Friday. I send out an email that gives detailed building level and district level reports going on throughout the district. The board members know that those are written largely by the building administrators and supervisors, and that I'm just kind of packaging it all together and sending it to them. So they get overwhelmed, because they can be quite voluminous, they get overwhelmed with authoritative information that's all tied to all of our initiatives. And even the ones that come on the board with that personal agenda have, this is my 7th year superintendent, slowly kind of come into the fold, and every once in a while they veer off when they've got their specific issue that's their hot button topic, and I know that I have a little more work to do there. But for the most part, even my naysayers, when they come on the board, after a period of time, they're overwhelmed with that communication, and the trust does come.
The trust does, yeah, and it's built. I mean, trust isn't something that comes right away. And unfortunately, I think too often it's the superintendent that is gets the brunt of when that trust starts to diminish, not only between school board members to one another, to the superintendent, to the district as a whole. It becomes a huge issue. Now, school level leaders are often asked to give presentations to the Board of Ed. As a superintendent, I think it's really important that you sit down with your school level leaders and review the presentation, review your expectations, anticipate questions that your school level leaders might receive. You don't want them to get blindsided. If Carmela is doing a report on our special ed test scores, and I know that one of the board members has a special ed son who failed the 3rd grade Ask Language Arts section, then Carmela needs to know she's going to get that question. Like, what are you doing for the 4th grade to make sure the special ed kids don't fail the NJAX? And so we need to sit through that and anticipate those questions. And I think that's essential because you want your school level leaders to be looked at as authorities on the subjects for which they have they're supposed to have the authority. But you also want the board to be able to feel like they can interact. So helping that board, helping that school level leader, and also talking to the board about what's really appropriate to ask an administrator and what's not. When Jill was our quad district curriculum coordinator and she would come do presentations, she couldn't talk about why a principal gave a certain teacher tenure because she had nothing to do with that. So I always talk to the board too, Jill's coming to present tonight. These are her responsibilities. Your questions should be within that scope. And sometimes that's difficult because, especially if the presentation is done in the public, and especially if there are many members of the public there, as we all know, our board members run for office. They are elected officials. And sometimes they feel the need to say things in public to appear, to appease a certain group who happen to show up one night out of 9 months. So it becomes that can become a difficult situation. But I do suggest that the school level leaders are well prepared, anticipate the questions, and keep it short and sweet. Because for most of us, we meet before the board meeting, sometimes several hours before the board meeting, mini meetings, executive sessions. By the time we get to that public session, the last thing the board members want to do is sit around and hear a long spiel about something you might already know. You might be doing something more for the public than actually for the board. So I always ask that the administrators keep it as short as possible. Now here's something that has, and I don't know if you guys have ever had this happen. You have a school level leader there, district level leader. You've done all this prep work. You've anticipated all the questions. And then the presentation starts to go. At what point as the superintendent do you step in? At what point do you